Hello everyone, and welcome to a an audio or podcast in relating to an important topic on an outline that relates polypharmacy and influence on renal insufficiency. And this work is a retrospective systematic review that had been conducted nearly in 2000, I believe in 2018, and this is collaborative work between um, sort of two academic excuse me, two academic institutions and the Renal Patient Support Group, or the RPSG. And this work is this work I'm providing an overview around is based on a research poster presentation that had been accepted for presentation to the for the Japanese Society of Nephrology, or the JSN. My name is Shahid Nazir Mohammed, and I'm going to give an overview of this work in sort of a in context in a kind of a in an overview way with some context. So to begin with, this is the aims of this work. This work was to this work looked to provide an analysis or an overview in relating to in relating to literature that had been, or research that had been research literature that had been appraised. So the aims was that this systematic review appraised the influence of polypharmacy on renal insufficiency in older people, and explored the following questions. Question number one was, should there be smarter medicines management to reduce polypharmacy in older people? And number two, question two was, can technology be used to determine who should be screened and screened for renal insufficiency if toxic drugs are overprescribed? And question three was, what are the advantages of technology that incorporates algorithms in collaborative working? So a bit of background around this work um, um, in relating to in relating to in relating to the systematic approach as well. So between 2005 between 2005 and 2015, so about 10 years, the percentage of individuals over 65 years of age in the UK had increased by just over 20%. The age group that saw the greatest percentage increase, percentage increase, was over 85s, which increased by just under 33%, representing about 300,000 people. 300,000 people, and that's been evidenced in a report by Age UK in 2017, and the National Health Service, a report that was published in 2019, and NHS England, the National Health Service for England division, highlighted some context in 2019 in a report that they had as well. So the number of people over the age of 85 years is projected to had been projected to double between 2012 and 2032. And there's a really nice sort of publication by by Druden and team in 2013, actually, that look at that highlight more around the sort of effects medicines or overprescribing has. And then there was a report by the Office for National Statistics in 2014 as well. So the incidence of comorbidities such as cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes increases in older individuals, and it had been reported that individuals over the age of 65 years experience 4 or more chronic illnesses for at least 2/3 of the time. And this had been documented or highlighted in works by Lusigan in 2009, and the Age UK report highlighted some context around that in 2017, and of course once again the NHS England report in 2019. As each illness can be treated with a range of different medications, the total number of drugs or medicines that an individual can take on a daily basis can be quite high, or can be very high. And Druden and team in 2013 highlight some of that context. And there's a really nice paper actually by Schmidt and team in 2019, which looked more specifically around polypharmacy, and actually developed sort of the underlying basis of sort of polypharmacy in their work as well, again in 2019. And many commonly prescribed and over-the-counter drugs or medicines, as well as supplements, herbal remedies, and natural products, food stores, natural products, and those in relating to natural products in food stores can actually can be or have what's known as a premise where these certain supplements, herbal remedies, medicines, whether over the counter or available in store, can have a sort of a can be nephrotoxic, so they can cause some problems around renal function to some extent. But when taken alone, the so they can be nephrotoxic when taken alone, and the risks increase further when several medicines are being sort of taken together, and that's being highlighted by the Renal Association in the UK, based on some of their works in 2019. Now, preventing overprescription is and has therefore been especially important in relating to works around older people who have an increased probability of developing renal insufficiency and leading to chronic kidney disease. And there's work actually retrospectively that by works by Jane et al. In 2008 and Jane and Simoy also in 2008 that sort of highlight kind of sort of an underlying link relating to medicines. Now, in relating to this background or this introduction, I'm now going to highlight why a systematic sort of an updated systematic review was required, and a bit about the systematic review approach. So the justification for this work was to actually look at the work in a sort of in a more robust and contextualized way of answering those questions that were outlined in the beginning. So the way this was done, the justification for including people over 65 years as elderly and justified as elderly care was based on NHS England's definitions provided by improving care for older people, and this was an NHS England report or sort of guideline that was published by NHS England in 2019, and another guideline framed as our growing older population, and that was published by Age UK in 2017. So the systematic review, this systematic review and the approach used those two sort of guidelines as a basis to form an overall sort of systematic review, and the search strategy around this was that a retrospective review was conducted in this work over a 21-year period. So and in line with this, a critical skills appraisals program was used to appraise papers methodically, and the critical appraisal skill program 2019 can be identified online, and sort of terminologies were arranged according to grouping of terms surrounding technology, polypharmacy, and primary care. And the poster presentation highlights different sort of tables and sort of tables and outlines in that complement the written context in this, and is available through the Renal Patient Support Group, the RPSG. But I'm just going to highlight a bit about what's in some of these tables. So in table 1, there was a grouping of the main terminology surrounding technology, polypharmacy, and primary care. So under each of those terminologies, there were additional sort of terminologies with the different words. And table 2 highlights a list of databases used to identify the literature, and table 3 summarizes the inclusion and exclusion criteria according to search strategy, and sort of guidance around that was actually provided by works published by Harrison and team in 2017. Systematic reviews, and also the Systematic Reviews Center for Reviews and Dissemination, which is a document that was published in 2008. And these were sought to reduce risk of bias, including non-randomized studies. Now, around context around the data extraction and synthesis around this. So now what I'm going to do, I'm highlighting the context in relating to having implemented a systematic review approach. I'm now going to highlight how many papers or publications that relate specifically to this topic around polypharmacy and the influence on renal insufficiency actually were identified accordingly. And in the poster presentation itself, there is a figure. There is in an original version of this work, there was an illustration which is referred to as what's known as a prism diagram, and basically the prism diagram highlights how when the systematic review approach is implemented, the prism illustration sort of highlights how different numbers of publications relate to directly to the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Unfortunately, the poster presentation doesn't have the prism illustration to complement some of the context here, but I am gonna highlight what the prism illustration would sort of show. So from a total number of 1,506 papers identified via several databases, via several databases, 1,491 papers were duplicates, and those duplicate papers were removed. So what this means is that where there was papers that were in one search database, and where some of those papers were in other databases, those papers where there were duplicates, so i.e. the exact same paper publication was identified in and around between the different databases, 1,491 papers were actually duplicates, and they were removed. So and then thereafter, after this, 44 papers were further scrutinized after taking the duplicates out for purpose to meet integrity and relevance according to those original terminologies, i.e. technology, polypharmacy, screening, and also technology and screening, technology, polypharmacy, and primary care accordingly. Now, from this, records and guidelines and framework type works or papers and policy reports that did not have a focus on renal insufficiency but had some focus around long-term healthcare and the NHS or the National Health Service, these were excluded. These papers were also excluded. Yes, in the number of papers in that the number of guidelines or frameworks or or sort of reports that were excluded in that regard, the number was 6. Full text articles and reports further assessed for eligibility around this was actually around the inclusion and exclusion criteria, and the poster presentation does highlight a table. One of the tables in the poster presentation itself has a list that according to inclusion and exclusion criteria. So full text articles and reports further assessed for eligibility according to the inclusion and exclusion criteria equals 32. And then full text articles full text articles full text articles omitted with explanations. So what this means is full text that had additional information that again did not meet or justify were not justified according to the systematic review approach. Those works were omitted from the systematic review. And then full text articles and reports further scrutinized after that, again using the critical appraisal skills program. 23 papers were included. So 23 papers out of, from what, as mentioned in the beginning, 1,506, 23 papers were included as part of this work in relating to the systematic review, and 6 themes were derived from those works. And in the poster presentation table, there's a table in the poster presentation that highlights sort of in relating to polypharmacy and the influence of renal insufficiency. There's a table that actually highlights the common causes of estimated glomerular filtration rate changes according to types of medicines and common causes of estimated glomerular filtration rate changes according to reversible causes of estimated glomerular filtration, and then common causes of renal insufficiency. So I'm now going to highlight a little bit of context according to the different themes. So there were 5 themes in this work that had been identified, and through this sorry, my apologies. There were 6 themes that were identified from these works, and I'm going to highlight a little bit of context according to the different themes. So characteristics of studies and the themes derived. So 6 themes derived from the literature review, or this, and the systematic review more robustly included the following themes. So healthcare scientists and leadership, roles smarter working and collaboration. 3 was chronic kidney disease, or CKD, primary care education. 4 was skill mix, and 5 was biomarkers biomarkers to detect renal insufficiency, and the final theme was around the role of education and healthcare professionals in relating to um, uh, elderly care. So basically, there was 6 themes, and all of these themes are relating to health relating to elderly care. Because remember this, as I mentioned, as part of the sort of the approach and the aims and objectives around this was to actually determine sort of the effect of polypharmacy and an influence on renal insufficiency, and the focus was around elderly care. Um, and so I'm going to read a little bit around each of these now. And so to begin with, theme 1, renal insufficiency. Okay. Okay. So to begin with, renal insufficiency, renal renal insufficiency, interventions in elderly care. So the context around this is that although research has not investigated full causations of chronic kidney disease or CKD, emphasis on the significance of using sort of the correct sort of causations to identify renal insufficiency in elderly care still needs to be made. In addition, due to a decreased sort of muscle mass, the elderly elderly people, or those as identified in these reports that kind of set the objectives around this work, those who are over 65 years old, for example, the elderly are a higher danger or higher risk of developing drug-induced renal insufficiency. And this is mainly because whereas people get older, and by the way, just some subcontext around this is that there is a report by the King's Fund, and I believe it's in 2018 or it was 2013, where basically the King's Fund highlighted works about where it's important that people live not just longer but also live longer but also healthier. So so in this context, as part of the sort of the backdrop on this, is that with people living longer, um, there has been a premise where sort of over the last decade, or at least over the time duration where literature was being developed, and in and around identifying literature around to conduct for around this systematic review. So in the time of 2008, let's say for example 2008 to 2018, people were living longer, and actually what we don't know, or at least reports have identified that it's important to offset some of the sort of the causations of what can prompt comorbidities. Now, in this context, where comorbidities are evident, then what happens is that to intervene and ensure that the comorbidities don't systemically cause problems, then elderly individuals, although saying elderly, they're not the only, they're not elderly aren't, for example, in reports aren't the only ones at risk, for example, but generally speaking, from a population health level, the reports highlighted that in some of these reports, those who are elderly are more at risk because for different comorbidities, different interventions are implemented, and therefore different interventions would then potentially prompt a higher probability of those for different patients where they could or can develop something that again that is referred to as, there's renal insufficiency, there's drug-induced nephrotoxicity, and ultimately causing kidney damage. The theme one here, it says, theme one from what I'm highlighting, approximately 7%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but 7% of all admissions to UK hospitals arise from the adverse effects of prescription medicines, and this includes inappropriate medication taking by patients, and about half of the individuals do not in fact adhere always to prescribed regimens, and there's wastage from unused prescribed medicines at the same time, and is estimated to cost almost £100 million every year in the UK. And some of that context is evidenced by work by Druden and team in 2013. So that's some context around theme one, renal insufficiency, interventions in elderly and interventions in elderly care. Now the next theme is about cost benefit of polypharmacy detection on renal insufficiency in elderly care. So in this context, around this, one team explores that 361, so almost 90% almost, so 88% specifically, out of 411 patients, so 361 patients out of 411 are accepted onto a form of renal replacement therapy or kidney replacement therapy in six units, six different sort of units in the southwest in the UK between the 1st of June 96 and the 31st of May 97. The team who look at this demonstrated that 124 patients, 35% were referred within 4 months of starting renal replacement therapy, and 84 within 1 month between patients later referred and other patients. So the main differences between patients referred later and other patients were seen for those referred for those referred within 1 month, and the elderly had more comorbidities, significantly inferior laboratory parameters at the onset, at the initiation and the start of renal replacement therapy, and this was less were less likely to also have received standard chronic kidney disease care, had less lasting hemodialysis treatment in place at the onset of renal replacement therapy. So it was turns out to be 18% versus 47%, and had a longer duration of infirmary time, so 18 versus 18 days versus 10 days, and 74 patients, or 19%, so almost 20% of the patients died actually during the first 6 months. 6 months. And in line with this, 12 there was other works which highlighted that 12 randomized sort of ACE angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor studies in 1943 inpatients. So those were patients who were already in hospital for not necessarily renal related or kidney related issues, but they were in hospital with variable sort of levels of hypertension, and also protein leaking from the kidneys as part of in relating to the comorbidities that they may have, and showed that the risk of developing renal insufficiency could be lowered by 30% over a 2 to 3 year duration. Retrospectively, there's works by Craig and team in 2002 that highlight how specific antihypertensives can be quite helpful for different comorbidities. In a GP sort of model comprising of a single of what's known as a single protein dipstick test to identify proteinuria as a form of screening for protein in the urine, and two, a 24-hour protein urine test, and three, the initiation of a angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor or ACE in suitable individuals. 20,000 people over the age of 50 would need to be screened. So this was intriguing as one of the findings in relating to cost benefit of polypharmacy, at least from a sort of a laboratory diagnosis or laboratory practice perspective, and that is to say, again, that 20,000 people over the age of 50 would need to be screened to avoid just one case of renal insufficiency, and that was works again evidenced in 2002 by Craig and team. Now a bit around theme 3, and this is around polypharmacy, dose adjustments, and medicines management in elderly care. So there's works by several authors in this context, and in here I'm just going to read this. So a retrospective study was conducted by one team to investigate patient referrals within 3 months of renal replacement therapy, compared to references 2 years later, and the number of patients stable for mild to moderate chronic kidney disease, whereas serious chronic kidney disease was noticeable, and there was a comparison sort of approach, and this was noticeable, and there was a shift from serious chronic kidney disease to patients referred to mild to moderate chronic kidney disease. So that was 28% versus 52%. And the team emphasizes the team that conducted this work emphasized the significance of increasing accessible resources of main care to prompt referral to specialists. So some of that where some of that referral is or that accessible where accessible resources are concerned and referral is concerned, this also includes aspects that relate to medicines management. And retrospectively, there's works by Mondry and team in 2004 that highlight that. Reducing sort of unnecessary polypharmacy by appropriate dose adjustments according to different medicines should reduce the impact of potential renal insufficiency in elderly care, and this in turn also reduces the burden of test requests from those sort of primary care physicians requesting sort of laboratory teams to conduct sort of testing investigations to understand drug toxicity, and ultimately overall reducing costs in the National Health Service as a whole. Now a little bit around theme 4, theme 4 relates to sort of technology integration to identify renal insufficiency, there's in this context, there's works by a team in the United States, where one team conducted case sampling strategy exploring primary care practice. This work was published by Fox and team in 2006, and the team explored primary care practices and knowledge surrounding renal insufficiency. Semi-structured interviews were also undertaken, and 10 randomly chosen practices were performed were involved, and 6 topics sort of were recognized. Number 1, absence of guidelines. 2, a desire for more guidance around renal insufficiency. 3, implemented appropriate screening at a timely manner. 5, timely manner. 4, variability in treatment decisions, and 5, uncertainty in patient referral times. Ultimately, the team identified that primary care has an important role to play where overprescribing and disease prevention is concerned. Medicines management is integral to monitoring renal insufficiency, what was ultimately identified was there must be also where technology is concerned, there must be good interoperability to achieve smarter workflows, and ultimately there is still a requirement for intuitive technology in context of use, and that's been documented or highlighted in a publication by Franco and team in 2016. And now a bit around theme 5, around theme 5, and here I'm going to just highlight a little bit around biomarkers to detect renal insufficiency in elderly care. So generally it is important that strategies are developed to prevent or preclude renal insufficiency in is to prevent renal insufficiency in elderly care, and there's there's papers and publications that highlight that retrospectively, going back all the way to 2004 actually. Um, and um, um, uh, and CKD stages 3 to 4, CKD stages 3 to 4 disease is not always associated with what's known as an increased albumin creatinine ratio, or ACR, or sometimes also referred to, so albumin creatinine ratio is also sometimes referred to as protein creatinine ratio, or PCR, and not to be confused with PCR in relating to in relating to other aspects aligning to laboratory practice, at least in context of this work. Uh, and in relating to this, uh, in relating to this is where in so it's not always associated with increased albumin creatinine ratio excretion, and this is where screening for low estimated glomerular filtration rate could be imperative. And in a Japanese survival rate analysis investigation, one team actually seek to explore early referral from primary care to nephrology for timely hemodialysis treatment. And there's a really nice paper by Nakamura in and team in 2007 that look at the importance of early referral, thus to avoid in some contexts those sort of healthcare expenses that are completely unavoidable when patients are diagnosed late but can't be helped. So in this work they look at the importance of early referral, and then and from another perspective they look at 366 patients with chronic kidney disease and cardiovascular disease are initiated onto a form of renal replacement therapy, namely hemodialysis, and this was where they did work assessed and looked at work between 1983 and 2003, and survival rate was actually followed up until 2005. Survival rates post initiation of hemodialysis was actually better in the early referral group, and age and pre-chronic kidney disease treatment and cardiovascular function has a significant impact on survival rate as well. In relating to biomarkers to detect renal insufficiency, along with sort of that intuitive technology to an extent, chronic if aligned with sort of areas of laboratory practices and in relating to biomarkers for screening, smarter technology would prompt swifter chronic kidney disease screening and reduce unnecessary sort of polypharmacy occurring as well. So that's some context around theme 5. And the final theme is actually around theme 6 is around the role of education and healthcare professionals sort of involved around that for elderly care. So one review found allied health professionals, or AHPs, face diverse encounters dealing with sort of so you have where I've mentioned comorbidities, then there's those after comorbidities there's something referred to as multi-morbidities, including overcoming polypharmacy challenges caused by fragmented healthcare services and technology. barriers and technology, barriers to shared decision making in the provision of patient-centered care, and complexity of following various guidelines, and generally context around different health professionals, um, and how different professionals are sort of almost allocated according to different areas of healthcare practices has been highlighted by Synot and team in 2013. And then following this, there is context where the where providing staff an age-centered education surrounding kidneys or chronic kidney disease is important. Is important owing to changes in healthcare, in health and disease over time. Primary care staff, or those working in primary care, should look to keep up to date with practices and with aspects that surround elderly care at risk, and consult renal guidelines to meet best practice. And it is good practice to ensure renal function and medicine use are regularly reviewed by primary care physicians and other qualified health professionals. And once again, overprescribing and disease monitoring sort of differ internationally, and this has been the case actually over the past 2 decades. And there's actually works or publications by Ordrador and Piera retrospectively highlight some context back in 1998, and there's Delusignan in 2005, and team in 2005, but also more recently. And there's the National Institute of Care and Excellence in 2009 and 2014, and once again there's a paper publication by Schmidt and team in 2019. Now, overall, after the themes had been identified, there was a critical analysis that kind of contextualizes the overall the findings. So prevention of renal insufficiency centers around control of sort of hypertension and other areas of health. Angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors and other sort of medicines have been recommended retrospectively. There is controversy, however, that over the benefit, for example, of a low protein diet, and this is no longer recommended hasn't been recommended by the National Institute of Care Excellence due to the inefficient evidence. And this is works that was published by the NICE in the National Institute of Care Excellence, or NICE, in 2014. And preventative measures are important as the prognosis for those who advanced renal disease or kidney disease have been shown to be poor, or the evidence. So the preventative measures, are important, and at the moment, the prognosis for those with advanced renal disease or kidney disease have been shown to be poor. So, for instance, in one investigational study, 89%, so 189 out of 210 patients of the study group had died or required a form of renal replacement therapy within 3 years. Within 3 years. And though this particular study that I'm making reference to is a little bit dated, it shows actually that in relating to sort of how health in relating to investigating areas around the influence around how polypharmacy is factored into where healthcare professionals are making sort of decisions. So in this context, works yeah. So 100. So for example, this work that I'm making reference to was a paper that was actually published in the noughties, and basically 100, where it says 189 patients out of 210 had died, where they required a form of renal replacement therapy within 3 years. And long-term therapy with doses of angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor actually prevents hypertension, decreases something known as hematocrit and proteinuria as well. And there's works by there's another study is known as the Perico's and team study in 2005, actually informs of how resources can be rationalized, reducing polypharmacy, renal disease progression, and cardiovascular risk may eventually improve, which should translate into less demand for hemodialysis, and thus provide alternative forms of renal replacement therapy. And again, that's been also substantiated by works by Nakamura and team in 2007. Progressive studies now need to recognize how health, education, technology, and systems could be better integrated to support smarter data capturing, medicines management, and even and across nutritional insights surrounding healthcare or care. And joined up technology would prevent polypharmacy in elderly care. So that's some context around the critical analysis. And now I'm just going to highlight the final parts around this particular poster presentation, and that is context that relates to the sort of recommendations and implications for practice or to practice, and then some conclusions. So there are obvious benefits that have benefit having integrated records, links to medications, history, bloods, urine, and other laboratory investigations. Having data algorithms and smarter links to NHS services could also highlight when elderly care would require where the elderly would require follow-up, preventing unnecessary polypharmacy, and implementing innovative medicines management. Is kind of integral as part of elderly care, and identifying prescriptions dispensed and administering sort of routines will help understand, number one, whether, for example, pharmacists should be providing more effective medicines, something that's known as medicines use reviews, and under the what's known as the, for example, the National Pharmacy Contract, MURs or medicines use reviews are known as advanced services and in this context, MURs for elderly. And number two, whether healthcare scientists would find it more appropriate to receive screening requests for cystatin C, the biomarker known as cystatin C, complementing in relating to creatinine screening, because cystatin C in works by I believe it's a Japanese team, or it might team or an Oriental team, where they actually highlight cystatin C seems to be more applicable or appropriate in sort of an older population, and then there's works that have been published to highlight that whether cystatin C, cystatin C has to be complemented with creatinine, because creatinine has been long-standing, a long-standing biomarker implemented to detect renal insufficiency, irrespective of age or race, for example. But cystatin C actually promises to be a bit more effective, but there are not enough. There hasn't been enough studies to actually investigate or highlight whether cystatin C can be used as standalone. And in some regards, physicians who practice in the field of nephrology and scientists generally would in some contexts would agree that that because creatinine has been long-standing, cystatin C in some contexts would be better to use, but the reason it hasn't been used in the main is not because of its issues around race or ethnicity. It's actually more because around the cost aspects around per test versus creatinine. And then another factor into this is that also which elderly should be referred more timely to secondary care owing to renal insufficiency. So those are some of the recommendations. And then steps in dealing with renal insufficiency also include identifying and screening elderly at risk in a smarter, more effective way, ensuring elderly are not overprescribed, and point three, treating comorbid conditions associated with renal insufficiency, including cardiovascular disease and anemia. Encouraging sort of isolated elderly to those who are isolated, those who don't, those who are elderly and have sort of mobility issues, for example, to encouraging them to partake in sort of physical activity to the best of their ability is actually important. And medicines, doses, nutrition, and fluid intake often also need adjustment. So these should be discussed in what I've referred to as group consultations or multidisciplinary team consultations to actually create a more person-centered care plan. And finally, some conclusions around this work. Whilst renal insufficiency terminology closely interconnects to kidney injury, it is more important to appreciate that chronic kidney disease 2 or stage 2 is also clinically, apparently in literature, has been deemed as clinically insufficiency. Clinically is clinically significant, but underreported. But it's underreported, and that's been documented in guidelines published by the National Institute of Care Excellence. And policymakers should continue to view polypharmacy as an ongoing concern, and education should be person-centered in any at population level and across in any population, and that's been published by and understood by works by Druden and team in 2013. And there is scope for education, service development, and initiatives focusing on allied health where focusing on sort of allied health professionals involvement, but there needs to be coordinated effort between sort of patient care and service providers. I was going to say service users and service providers, to understand where this can complement and improve chronic kidney disease care, to focus education, and one example has been where, or at least some works that has been sort of developed at the moment, is where the renal patient support group, or the RPSG, along with their point of care education pathway, and where, according to the type of clinical or non-clinical case scenario that is, for example, posted on the RPSG, that can be aligned to a particular guide or algorithm to assess chronic kidney disease patients, for the type or format of advice or educational support that they could benefit from or find advantage from. And so this poster presentation sort of gives an overview of those particular a proposed point of care education pathway for CKD patients to receive appropriate healthcare guidance and sort of advice or educational support according to the scenario that they fall within, and also between sort of primary and secondary care healthcare sectors. And then so there's a figure in this poster presentation that relates to that, and there's also a figure in this poster presentation that relates to a proposed technology or online space guide for advice, advice or educational support in relating to an algorithm that can be sort of implemented, and the technology around that hasn't been developed at the moment. It is something that I believe the RPSG team are looking to adapt into aspects of their work, of the sort of ongoing works that are being have been developed already, but ultimately the point of care education pathway and the sort of algorithm relating to advice and educational support provision is where patients and professionals at different levels can all be involved and provide the appropriate support according to scenarios, and ultimately where patients are peers with each other, as they have been in the across the renal patient support group, but also how health professionals could also be involved, and where there's peer support, as professionals are peers with professional colleagues, but ultimately where peers are professionals, where in relating to patients being professionals with health professionals, and how health professionals see patients not as patients but actually as colleagues, collaborators, and their peers. So that would actually prompt more joined up thinking, and in relating to this work around polypharmacy and influence of renal insufficiency, should ultimately bring more sort of aligned aspects of healthcare more generally speaking. So finally, I'm just going to highlight that this work has been published. The full citation is actually by Mohammed in 2020, and the paper is called Polypharmacy, Renal Insufficiency and Elderly Care, and it's a systematic review, and it was published in the Journal of Kidney Care in 2020, and that is available online. But this has been the recording around this works, and is as I mentioned, this is a poster presentation overview. So I hope this has been intriguing. Any questions relating to this, feel free to follow up through the renal patient support group. And apologies for the length of this work, but it has there's in relating to a systematic review versus a literature review or a narrative review or any other kind of work. A systematic review is more in depth, so hopefully this has provided some basis of that. Thank you for taking the time to listen.